company's CFO embezzled $3 million and made sure my name was on every single document. My own boss handed me over to federal investigators until they opened the email I'd scheduled 6 months earlier. The day I got promoted to Senior Financial Analyst at Westcott Capital, my mother cried. Not because she was proud, though she said that too. She cried because she remembered the nights I'd spent at the kitchen table in our apartment in Columbus, working through accounting textbooks, while she slept on the couch in her scrubs after a double shift at the hospital. She remembered writing bad checks for my college application fees and hoping they'd clear before the weekend. So when I called her from the parking garage of Westcott's downtown Chicago office, still holding the congratulations card my team had signed, she sobbed into the phone and said, "Baby, we made it." That was 14 months before I sat in a federal holding room that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, trying to explain to 2 IRS criminal investigation agents why my employee ID number appeared on 37 fraudulent wire transfers totaling just over $3 million. I want to tell you I saw it coming. I want to say there were signs, and I just missed them. The truth is messier than that. The truth is that I trusted the wrong person completely, and I did it with my eyes wide open because he was brilliant and charming, and he had personally championed my promotion in front of the executive board. His name was Clifford Renshaw, and for 11 months he was the best boss I'd ever had. Cliff was Westcott's CFO, 52 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order and your mother's name in the same breath. He'd built the Treasury Operations Division from a 4-person team into a 40-person department, and he ran it with a particular brand of relaxed authority that made everyone feel like they were in on a secret. When he asked me to become his direct reports manager for the Meridian portfolio, a cluster of mid-sized commercial real estate accounts, I said yes before he'd finished the sentence. For the first several months, the job was exactly what it looked like. I reviewed account activity, flagged anomalies, prepared quarterly summaries for the board. Cliff reviewed everything before it went up. He had a habit of making small edits in red pen and leaving the marked up pages on my desk with a sticky note that said almost or nearly there or occasionally, "This is the one." I kept every sticky note. I am not proud of that now. The first time something felt off was a Tuesday in February. I was running reconciliation on the Meridian sub-accounts when I noticed a transfer of $214,000 to a vendor I didn't recognize. The company was called Halcyon Advisory Group. The documentation was clean, a consulting invoice, a corresponding PO, all the right approval signatures. But I'd never heard of them, and when I searched our internal vendor database, they'd been added only 11 days earlier. I left a note for Cliff asking about it. He stopped by my office the next morning with 2 cups of coffee and a relaxed smile. Halcyon was a new strategic consulting partner, he said. Boutique firm, very specialized, board already signed off. He handed me a supplementary memo with the proper authorizations and told me to file it with the quarter documentation. I did. Because the paperwork was there. Because he was the CFO. Because I had no reason yet to look harder. By April, I had 3 more Halcyon invoices. By June, 7. Each one perfectly documented, each one routed through my review queue with Cliff's approval codes already attached, so my job was effectively just to log them and move on. The amounts were always under $250,000, which I later understood was deliberate. Our internal audit flag threshold was $300,000. He had engineered the entire structure to stay just below the line. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known from inside the system he'd built, was that Halcyon Advisory Group was a shell company registered to a nominee director in Delaware. Its bank account connected to a wire routing chain that ended in a private account in the Cayman Islands, and the employee ID number attached to every single approval log in the system as the originating analyst on each transfer was mine. Cliff had been building this for over a year before I arrived. He needed a name on the documentation. Someone junior enough to be plausibly responsible, senior enough to have legitimate system access, new enough to the role that they wouldn't know what they were looking at. I was perfect. I had access to the Meridian accounts. I was diligent and thorough, which meant my approval logs looked clean and consistent. And I trusted him. I found out on a Thursday in September. Our external auditors, Kessler and Blaine, arrived for a routine quarterly review. That part was normal. What wasn't normal was when their lead auditor, a quiet woman named Ms. Parrish, asked if she could speak with me privately. I remember thinking she wanted to go over some documentation detail. I offered her a seat in the small conference room and pulled up my files. She put a printed ledger on the table between us. She asked me to explain the Halcyon account. I explained it the same way I always had. Consulting vendor. CFO approved. Board authorized. She put a second document on the table. It was a bank record, Halcyon's account, showing the incoming transfers and a secondary transfer out, dated 2 days after each one, to a personal account. She asked me to confirm whether I had authorized those secondary transfers. I said no. I said I had never seen that account. I said I had never transferred money anywhere except through the standard vendor payment system. She thanked me, closed her folder, and within the hour, 2 men from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division were in our conference room asking to speak with all Meridian team members. By end of day, Cliff was being escorted out of the building with a cardboard box. By the following morning, so was I. The investigators were not cruel to me, but they were not warm either. They had documentation, they had system logs, they had my employee ID on every single transaction. They explained, very patiently, that the approval workflow I had described, where Cliff pre-attached authorization codes before transfers hit my queue, would have required me to have also confirmed each transfer through a secondary sign-off step that only I could complete. I stared at them across that table and said I had never done a secondary sign-off. They showed me the system logs. Every secondary sign-off had been completed from my workstation. I thought about how many times I'd stepped away from my desk with my computer unlocked. How many times Cliff had stopped by my office when I was in the break room or in a meeting or on a call. How many times I'd come back to find a marked-up document on my keyboard and assumed he'd just dropped it off. He'd been using my workstation. He had been walking into my office, sitting down in my computer and completing the approval steps under my credentials. For months. They didn't formally charge me that day. They told me I was a person of interest, that I should retain legal counsel, and that I should not discuss the matter with anyone at Westcott. I was placed on administrative leave with a letter that used the phrase pending investigation 4 times in 2 paragraphs. My mother called that evening. I couldn't tell her. I said work was stressful and I'd explain later, and I listened to her tell me about her garden and her neighbor's new dog, and I sat on my bathroom floor after we hung up and did not cry because I was too frightened to cry. Fear is a very particular kind of cold. It lives in your sternum. I hired an attorney, a woman named Ms. Oyalaran, who specialized in white-collar defense and had the particular quality of making you feel, in the middle of a catastrophe, that catastrophes were manageable. She reviewed everything I gave her, the transaction logs, the vendor documentation, Click's memos, the timeline, and she looked at me across her desk and said, "The documentation is very clean. Too clean. That's actually your best argument, but it wasn't enough. The system logs place my credentials on every transaction. The secondary approvals had been completed from my physical workstation. The vendor setup had been initiated during a period when I was the active Meridian analyst. Without corroborating evidence that I hadn't personally taken those actions, it was going to come down to my word against a paper trail." I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I thought about the $3 million I had never touched. I thought about my mother's face when I told her I got the promotion. I thought about what a federal fraud conviction does to a career, to a life, to a person. And then I thought about something I had set up in March. Something small and specific that I'd done because of a different problem entirely. The previous winter, I'd gone through an ugly situation with a former manager at a previous job. He'd taken credit for a major deliverable I'd produced, and when I'd raised it internally, there was no documentation to back me up. I had the work, but not the receipts. I swore I'd never be in that position again. So when I started at Westcott, I built myself a quiet system. Every Friday at 4:45 p.m., I ran a personal documentation script I'd written. Nothing sophisticated, just a Python tool that pulled my activity logs from the previous week, timestamped them, and packaged them with my sent emails and a brief summary of what I'd reviewed and approved. Then it attached them to an email and scheduled it to send to my personal Gmail account the following Monday morning. That way I always had an independent off-network record of my own work week. My attorney had been right that the documentation was too clean, but she didn't know yet what I knew. Every Friday without exception that script had run for 11 months, which meant I had 47 weeks of independent, time-stamped activity logs sitting in a Gmail folder labeled Weekly Backup, delivered to an account that Westcott's IT department had no access to on a server that no one had thought to secure or suppress. The logs showed exactly what I had and hadn't done each week. They showed my approvals, and critically, they showed the timestamps on my workstation activity throughout each day. What they also showed, if you knew how to read them, were the gaps. Short windows of 10 to 15 minutes, occurring on the same days as several of the Halcyon transfers where my workstation showed activity, but my concurrent calendar blocks and email timestamps placed me somewhere else in the building. A 10-minute gap at 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday when my calendar showed a meeting in Conference Room B on the 4th floor, my workstation was on the 7th floor. Someone had been at my computer, and the logs proved it wasn't me. I called Ms. Oyeleran at 8 in the morning and read her the relevant entries over the phone. There was a very long pause on her end. Then she said, "Send me everything, all 47 weeks." She filed a motion for evidentiary disclosure the following week, requesting that the investigators cross-reference the system approval timestamps with building access logs, calendar records, and the concurrent workstation activity from my machine. The building used a keycard system for floor access. Every time I swiped in or out of the 7th floor, it was logged. On the day of one of the largest Halcyon transfers, a $247,000 wire that had gone through at 2:31 p.m., on a Wednesday in May, my keycard showed me entering the 3rd floor conference wing at 2:24 p.m. and not swiping back to the 7th floor until 3:08 p.m. The secondary approval for that transfer was logged at 2:31 p.m. from my workstation on the 7th floor. I was not on the 7th floor at 2:31 p.m. on that Wednesday. The building knew it. The keycard knew it, and now the investigators knew it. They brought Cliff back in for questioning. He had retained a very expensive attorney and had spent the previous 3 weeks quietly building a narrative that positioned me as a rogue junior employee who had exploited a lax approval structure. His account included a carefully constructed detail about how he had raised concerns about my work to HR in August. A meeting that, as it happened, HR had logged, but that had never produced a written record because Cliff had requested it stay off file. A verbal concern. Very difficult to disprove. What he hadn't anticipated was that I had 47 weeks of documentation and a keycard system that didn't lie. The cross-reference analysis identified 6 transactions where the approval timestamp placed activity at my workstation during periods when building access records confirmed I was on a different floor. In 2 additional cases, I was logged as having badged out of the building entirely, grabbing lunch, attending an off-site meeting, during the precise windows when my workstation was being used to process approvals. His attorney requested a delay. The investigators denied it. In the end, it was the gap on the 3rd floor conference wing that broke him. The investigators showed him the keycard records. They showed him the concurrent workstation log. They asked him to explain how a person approves a wire transfer on the 7th floor while simultaneously swiping into a meeting room on the 3rd. He didn't answer. He sat very still, and then he asked to speak to his attorney privately. He entered a cooperation agreement 9 days later. He confessed to building the Halcyon shell structure, to using my workstation and credentials without my knowledge, and to deliberately setting up the approval routing to generate a false documentation trail implicating me. He identified the offshore accounts. He named the nominee director. The full recovery amount, including interest and penalties assessed against his personal assets, came to slightly over $3.4 million. My administrative leave was lifted on a Monday. The letter used the phrase "no finding of wrongdoing" twice, and the phrase "regret any disruption" once, and it was signed by Westcott's general counsel rather than anyone I had actually worked with. My direct supervisor sent me a separate email saying he was glad it had been resolved and asking if I was planning to return to my position. I sat with that email for 2 days. Then I called Miss Oyeleran. There were damages to discuss. The administrative leave had been public enough within the firm that my professional reputation had sustained real harm. There were emails, there were whispers, there were 2 industry colleagues who had quietly withdrawn from introductory conversations during the investigation period. I had documented all of it because by that point documentation was simply what I did. We settled with Westcott for a figure I'm not going to put in writing, but which was sufficient to pay off my student loans, establish a 6-month emergency fund, and contribute meaningfully to the down payment on the condo I'd been saving toward for 3 years. The settlement also included a letter of clearance that I could provide to future employers, confirming that I had been fully exonerated and that my termination from administrative leave had resulted from a third-party criminal investigation in which I was not a subject. Cliff was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. He will be eligible for supervised release in 4. He had a vacation home in Lake Geneva and a daughter in college and a reputation that had taken 25 years to build. I know, because I looked it up, that his LinkedIn still lists Westcott as his most recent employer with no end date. The system, apparently, had not caught up with him yet. I called my mother the night the agreement was finalized. I told her everything, from the February invoices to the keycard logs to the settlement call that morning. She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "You documented it." "I raised you to document things." She was, technically, not wrong. She'd made me keep a journal every summer growing up, and she'd kept every receipt from every bill she'd ever contested. Some lessons come from textbooks. Some come from watching your mother fight the utility company from a kitchen table in Columbus at 11 o'clock at night. I took a week off before starting my job search. I drove up to Michigan and stayed at a friend's lake house and did not look at my email for 4 days, which is the longest I have gone without checking my email since approximately 2017. On the 5th morning, I sat on the dock with coffee and watched a heron stand motionless in the shallows for almost 20 minutes before it moved, and I thought, that is exactly the kind of patience I needed more of. Stillness as a strategy. Waiting until you know. I am now a senior analyst at a firm I am not going to name here, because I value my privacy more than I value the satisfying detail. The work is quieter, and the floors are fewer, and no one has ever needed to sign a settlement agreement with me. I still run my Friday documentation script every week without exception. I still arrive with my receipts. I always will. 3 weeks into the new job, my manager stopped by my desk to tell me I was doing well and asked if I had any questions about the systems. I said no, I'd figured most of it out. She smiled and moved on. I turned back to my screen. I had already mapped the approval workflow. I already knew which transactions touched my queue and which didn't. I already knew where the flag thresholds were. I wasn't looking for problems. I was just making sure I'd see one coming if it did. That's not paranoia. That's documentation. There's a difference, and the difference once paid for my condo. I've thought a lot about what actually saved me, and it wasn't luck. That's the part I need to say clearly, because luck is a comfortable story, and this wasn't a comfortable situation. What saved me was a habit I'd built out of bitterness. A previous manager had stolen credit for my work, and I had nothing, no receipts, no timestamps, no record that the idea had ever lived in my head before it appeared under his name in a board presentation. That humiliation taught me something that no professional development seminar ever did. The person with the documentation controls the narrative, not the loudest person, not the most senior person, the person who kept their records. Cliff Renshaw was brilliant at constructing narratives. He'd had 25 years to practice. He knew how institutions work, how investigators think, how to make a paper trail point in the direction he'd chosen. He built a system that was genuinely elegant in its precision, approvals just below the flag threshold, a shell company with clean invoicing, a junior employee's credentials threaded through every transaction. He had thought through almost everything. What he hadn't thought through was that I was also the kind of person who kept records, not because I suspected him, not because I'd seen it coming, simply because I had been burned once before, and I had decided quietly on a Sunday afternoon in my apartment, when I set up that script, that I would never be in that position again. I documented my work the way my mother kept utility receipts, not expecting a fight, just refusing to be caught without proof if one arrived. That's the part that stays with me. The protection wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confrontation or a clever move in the moment. It was 47 boring Friday afternoons running a script and letting it send an email I never expected to need, discipline that looked like nothing, preparation that felt like routine. There's something I think about when I consider what Cliff actually lost. He didn't just lose his freedom and his career and his vacation house in Lake Geneva. He lost the thing he'd spent his entire adult life building, which was a reputation for being trustworthy, for being the person who made things work. And he lost it because he believed that intelligence without integrity was a sustainable long-term strategy. It isn't. It never is. The smarter you are, the more elaborate the structure you can build, but the structure still rests on the same foundation, and if the foundation is dishonest, eventually the weight of it collapses inward. What I want to say to anyone who is sitting where I was sitting, in that holding room, in that cold, with your hands folded and your entire professional identity under question, is this: the truth is only as powerful as your ability to prove it. Feeling wronged is not enough. Knowing you're innocent is not enough. Integrity without evidence is just a private experience. You have to build the habit of protecting yourself before you need protection, because the moment you need it is not the moment you have time to build it. I still run the script every Friday. I still arrive with my receipts. I still know where every approval in my queue originates and what it connects to. That's not fear. That's just who I decided to become the first time someone tried to take something that was mine. The condo is nice, by the way.